Greetings, APUSH scholars. This is our review for Unit 1 on Pre-Columbian Indians, Exploration, Discovery, and Colonization. Looking at a review sheet for my class and starting with Indians' interaction with their environments. Think about the summer work I had you do. You did this chart talking about how the Indians survived in their respective environments. Just looked at over some examples. You've got the Great Basin Indians gathering pine nuts to help them survive through the rest of the year. You've got the Indians in the Southwest irrigating the desert by diverting river water to grow the Three Sisters. You should know the Three Sisters. These are these crops which are grown together: corn, beans, and squash. And the Indians figured out how to fix nitrogen back in the soil inadvertently here by growing these crops together. This is something the Europeans had found out in Europe as well. You have your Pacific Northwest Indians that are doing the catches of the salmon runs and drying these fish for the rest of the year. You've got your Plains Indians who are hunting the bison. They're hunting the bison with horses that they get from the Spanish after the Spanish show up. And the bison, they're wearing the hides, they're eating the meat, and they're using the hides for teepees, for example. And then you've got your woodlands Indians. And the woodlands Indians in the eastern part of what would be the United States are largely farmers growing corn in the summer, but they're hunting in the winter, and insofar as they're living anywhere near water, on the Great Lakes, on rivers, or on the ocean, they're fishing, they're clamming, they're taking advantage of the abundance of sea life here. How are the Indians interacting with various European nations? The Spanish are including the Indians in Catholic society. There's this what's called the requerimento, which is a requirement to convert, to be baptized, or to be subjugated, which happens anyways in the encomienda system, where the Indians are forced to work on Spanish farms and in Spanish mines. But there is this new race called the mestizo, which is coming out of the the relationship between Spanish men and Indian women, and the Indians are adopted into, embraced in this larger Spanish Catholic society. The Indians, the Spanish set up missions where they're converting the Indians and teaching them European ways, European skills. This doesn't happen so much among the French and the Dutch. The French and the Dutch come over in much smaller numbers. And although there are, with the French, missionaries, there is more of a lead me, sort of show me where the animals are, the pelts that we're looking for. So there's more of a cooperative relationship. The French, the coureurs de bois, these woods runners, are with the Indians deep in the interior, looking for these beaver pelts, which have high value, trade value in Europe. The English are the most exclusive or exclusionary in that they're not embracing Indian culture. They're not bringing them into any sort of church. There's some sort of weak attempts to evangelize. But the English, remember, these are Puritans. These are Calvinists. And the Indians are not saved. They're not among the elect. So basically, at best, the European English are buying land, or they're taking it. And any marriage, something that would happen with Pocahontas and John Rolfe, are the exception that proves the rule that the Indians don't belong in English society. The Columbian Exchange refers to the movement across the Atlantic of plants and animals. And the Indians are going to be sending to Europe corn and potatoes are two of the big ones here. Potatoes are grown in kind of easy to grow in sandy, rocky soil, so they're going to be used to great success in places like Ireland and Scandinavia, with a corresponding population spike in the years to come. And tomato was more like one crop that goes to Europe. No Italians ever saw tomato until it comes from the New World. The other direction is perhaps more significant. To the New World are coming wheat, coming barley, coming oats, coming rice. It's been grown on the Carolina coast. And you have large animals. The Indians did not have horses. They didn't have cows. They didn't have pigs or goats or chickens until these come over with the colonists. And you have other crops, things like coffee and oranges are coming over with the Europeans. But most devastating, the Europeans, again, inadvertently, not intentionally, are bringing over diseases. diseases which were endemic, which means that they were around in Europe, and you might get them as a kid, but normally they didn't kill you. Things like smallpox, the measles, mumps, chickenpox, scarlet fever. These things were lethal. The Indians died, about 90% of them died within 100 years. And this is sort of the equivalent of the Black Death in Europe. We have accounts many of these Indians would die within 24 hours of getting these diseases, which the Europeans just sort of lived through and didn't think that much of. You have these Indian wars that take place. The Powhatan War is in Virginia, and there's a huge massacre of settlers that takes place, but the Europeans have got guns, the Europeans have got reinforcements, the Europeans keep coming, and the Powhatan Indians are eventually pushed aside. The Pequot Wars are against the Massachusetts Indians over land, and the Pequots are the great losers here as well. And then there's King Philip's War, and his Indian name is Metacomb, and a huge massacre takes place all across New England, and it's over the anger over the colonists grabbing Indian land, and the Indians here eventually will lose because of the superior weaponry and greater numbers of the Europeans as they keep coming and as they keep coming. Just to take note, the Mound Builders refers to this civilization that would be the Mississippi Valley. You have the Hopewell and the Idana cultures, and you have Cahokia, the city which is sort of within eyesight of St. Louis today. We've got this 100-foot mound, and the mound builders, we don't know exactly why they built these mounds. They could have had religious or political, ceremonial, perhaps trade purposes, or all of these put together. But many of them have left behind these mounds. Some of them are in the shape of animals and such. The Puritans come over in 1630. The Pilgrims come over in 1620. The difference is not really significant. Theologically, these are the same group. They're persecuted by the Church of England, and they're coming over for religious freedom. The Separatists are that first group, better known as the Pilgrims. They're coming over to separate. They want nothing to do with the Puritans or with the Church of England. The Puritans come over, and their goal is to purify the church. They're reformers, and they're coming over to build this city on a hill. And that comes from a sermon better known as The Model of Christian Charity by John Winthrop, the leader of the Puritans. And it's a really neat sermon about watching each other's back, about caring for the poor, about having charity, loving your hearts towards each other. And the goal here is a community of faith, which will be faithful to God, faithful to Jesus, and will be this beacon of showing how true Christians live. And the Mayflower Compact, before they get off the boat, the Puritans realize they've been blown off course. They're not in Virginia where they're supposed to be going. They're farther north in what is current-day Massachusetts, and they're making this agreement that they will make laws that they will follow together. It's an early democratic document. The importance of ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is another name for church government. And the Puritans are practicing a democratic form of government within their churches. There's two brands of Puritanism. You have the larger sort called Congregationalism, which very simply the members of a congregation elect. They choose their own pastor, and they sort of force that person out the door when they get tired of him. So this is democracy in action in the church. And you have Presbyterianism, which is more of a representative democracy. A series of churches sends an elder to what's called a presbytery. A presbytery is a meeting concerning issues common to this group of churches. And the decision of the presbytery is binding on those churches, but they have sent elders to the presbytery, so they have had a say in the first place. Church of England is this church which, remember, it breaks off from Rome. You guys know Henry VIII in this deal. He wants to divorce from his wife Catherine, and he's got this mistress Anne Boleyn who is pregnant, and he's got to get rid of this wife quickly. And this is all about a divorce. This is a personal thing. This isn't like Martin Luther's Reformation, which is religious in nature. And there's a lot of Englishmen who are unhappy that the Church of England is still too Catholic-y, and the Church of England is demanding cooperation and obedience and submission by all, and there's a whole bunch of groups that are in disagreement. You've got your Catholics who are still hiding out, you've got your Puritans, you've got your Quakers, and you've got some early Baptists, and they're all going to be fleeing. Many of them are going to be fleeing to this new world. Keep in mind the Bible is the source of truth. It's the source of authority. That is how God is revealing himself to the Puritans. And to this end, the Old Deluder Act is a law requiring communities with over 50 people to set up a school and a teacher to teach young kids how to read, yes, the Bible, and to train pastors how to preach the gospel, how to preach from the Bible. You have Harvard University, which is originally set up to be a seminary, and Harvard still has a Congregationalist seminary attached to it. Some other colonies to take note of. Rhode Island is settled by rebels against the Puritan theocracy here. You've got Roger Williams, who is a Puritan pastor who's given the boot because he is teaching separation of church and state, that the state does not have the right to require people to worship a certain way against their will. He's also given the boot because he says the Indians need to be treated fairly. You can't just take their land. And Hutchinson is an interesting woman, kind of a proto-feminist, as it were. She is a female preacher in a world of hierarchy where women are supposed to be quiet in church. And she's also challenging, though, the legalism of the Puritans. She's challenging the right of the Puritans to make laws, which the Puritans assume that you need to have laws that people must follow to have a godly community, or God will not bless their venture. But this is dangerous. If you don't follow these laws, God won't, his face won't shine kindly on the Puritans. And so what does she mean when she says you don't have to follow the laws? There's a fancy name for this. It's called antinomianism. And this means that we're not led by laws, but we're saved by grace. We're saved by God's mercy, not by what we do. And God reveals himself through the working of the Holy Spirit, this third person of the Trinity, in our hearts. God writes the laws in our spirit, in our souls, in our hearts, and that we should be following God's leading that way, not by some legalistic laws. So Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson, by advocating separation of church and state and antinomianism, are shown the exit out. Connecticut is founded by Thomas Hooker, and you have the fundamental orders, it's a constitution which is allowing all free men to vote. In early Massachusetts, only all free churchmen could vote. Pennsylvania is settled by William Penn, and he is the inheritor of a debt that the king owes his father, and this is being paid off by making him a proprietor of this land, which is called Pennsylvania. And this is a place for Quakers to be free, but the Quakers allowed freedom of religion for everyone. And the Quakers are famous for, at least originally, and the intention here, the Quakers believed you should pay the Indians, you shouldn't take their land. The Quakers are the first religious group in English North America to condemn slavery, and the Quakers are famous for allowing the Indians to the women to participate equally in group worship. The Quakers did not have clergy. Maryland is settled by Lord Baltimore as a haven for Catholics, and the Catholics there set up the Toleration Act, which is going to allow all Trinitarians, and this is basically most Christians, to have religious freedom, another area of toleration. The Dutch are first in New York, which is called the New Netherlands, and the capital is called New Amsterdam. This is taken by the English by force, but the Dutch have laid this framework for religious toleration. Remember the Dutch, especially in the 1600s, are this famous trading nation. They are rich and prosperous, and religious intoleration just gets in the way of doing business. So the Dutch are famous for allowing basically any group to worship. There is a Reformed church of Dutch Calvinists, but the city of New York is allowing Jews safe haven, these Portuguese Jews who are fleeing persecution in Europe. Georgia is settled by James Oglethorpe. He is a philanthropist, an altruist, and he is settling Georgia as a place of second chance for debtors. It's a place for former prisoners. And Georgia is also being settled as a buffer against Spanish Florida just to the south. Virginia, I don't have this in sequential order on this review sheet. Virginia is settled in 1607. This is 13 years before the Pilgrims and 23 years before the Puritans. Virginia is originally settled by people looking for gold and silver. They know that the Spanish are looting the Aztecs and the Incas, and 1500s is the century of the Spanish bringing these galleons full of gold and silver. And Virginia is settled. The hope is to pull a Spain and find money, which they don't. And Virginia has a hard go of it until John Rolfe brings over this West Indian, this Caribbean, what's called sweet tobacco, better than the tobacco that's actually on the mainland. And the Virginians can't plant enough of this. The Europe is a market for tobacco, and that will save the day for Virginia. Some groups that are filling in the labor gap, you've got what are called indentures. These are white Englishmen who are agreeing to generally a 7-year contract. You get your way paid over to the New World, and then you basically work as a white slave. But after that, you get your freedom. Sometimes the terms give you some land, give you some tools, but then you become a poor farmer. So they can only push you around for so long. And the Indians are enslaved. The Virginians, the Spanish, the settlers in New England, they enslave the Indians. They enslave them, or they're sold into slavery. And the Indians will die out, and the Indians will flee into the woods. So this is sort of only a temporary solution, and you're going to have the enslavement of Africans. The first African slaves will show up in Virginia in 1619, and there's an irony here. There's a great American contradiction. 1619 is the same year that the House of Burgesses, the first elected representative government, is set up in Virginia. So slavery takes root at the same time that representative democracy is taking place also in Jamestown. Slavery exists, and this should be noted. Slavery does exist in all of the northern colonies. Places like New York City are maybe 20% or so slaves. But overall, slavery does not spread to a large extent in the northern colonies because the soil, and this is a generalization, the soil is rockier, it's not as fertile as down farther south. So slaves are very expensive, and you don't get the same profit by working an expensive slave on a small farm. But there are slaves along the coast, and we'll get into this later when we get into the post-revolution. But you've got these ideologies of freedom. You have the Quakers. You have reasons in the North where slavery, within probably 20 years of the American Revolution, slavery is going to be abolished in the North, partly because there isn't this great dependence on it. Slavery's effect on Southern whites. There is a hierarchical society is created in the South with a wealthy elite in control of these large plantations. And the economy is largely going to be steered by these wealthy elites who are exporting tobacco. It's only after the Revolution you have the export of cotton. Remember, for the AP, if they ask you, about trade before the American Revolution, cotton is a very minor, very expensive crop. Cotton becomes very profitable after the cotton gin. That's not until the 1790s, after the American Revolution, and we're not there yet. You have the export of indigo and rice and tobacco. These are what are called export or cash crops. And this wealthy elite is largely controlling the economy, controlling the politics, and you have a large number of illiterate, poor white farmers. And you have, correspondingly, you have limited growth of cities. Many of these plantations are essentially self-supporting. You have not much in the way of public schooling. Remember, religion's not motivating the settlement of Virginia And you have essentially over time here, with slavery, you have the creation of a sort of a police state here, where you've got lookouts for runaways, you have bounty hunters, you've got censorship of abolitionist stuff, which is not in this period, but When you get to that period between the Revolution and the Civil War, you have this established system of limiting any opposition to slavery and looking for runaways and setting up a system that keeps slaves in their place. The South, you're going to have slavery is going to retard innovation and invention and creativity. Less immigrants are going to go to the South. Understandably, why would you compete with slaves who are working, quote unquote, for free? And you have the plantation system in the Caribbean is going to be taking most of the slaves. Only about 10% at tops are going to North America. Slaves are growing growing sugar in the Caribbean, and the American colonies, and this is going up into the north as well, are going to be sending cereals, and they're going to be sending, meats down, smoked meats and stuff down to the Caribbean. And the Chesapeake crops of tobacco and indigo and food crops are going to Europe and are going to the Caribbean. Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, kind of easy to remember. It's 100 years before 1776, American independence. Bacon's Rebellion is this kind of a turning point where these freed indentures out on the frontier who are being attacked by the Indians because they're moving on to Indian lands are going to rise up against the Jamestown government, which they feel is ignoring them. These people can't vote. They are sort of being betrayed by Lord Berkeley, who's the governor, who's dealing with the Indians, in a friendly way so that he can get animal furs from them. These poor whites are going to rise up and march on Jamestown, and they're going to burn it to the ground. And Nathaniel Bacon, the leader, is going to die of some disease before there can be a suppression by English soldiers here. But this shows that the freed indentures are dangerous, that you want somebody who's more docile, more controllable, and you're just going to see a rise in the use of slaves. Although, keep in mind, by the time of the American Revolution, about half of the whites that came to America were indentures, but the use of indentures will go down and the use of slavery will accelerate, will increase because of Bacon's Rebellion. Some terms to know. Mercantilism refers to the idea that the mother country should have a positive balance of trade, that there should be more wealth coming in than going out. You don't want to leak gold and silver to your trading competitors. So colonies, you should have your own colonies that provide resources, and those colonies should be purchasing manufactures, things made out of metal, out of textile, and you're not supposed to be trading with other countries without permission. And the Navigation Acts are these laws telling the Americans you can only trade with England on English ships. You guys know the triangular trade, and it's this idea the colonists are trading with Africa, and they're sending things like rum from New England, and they're buying slaves, and the slaves are being dropped off in the Caribbean, and molasses and sugar are being brought back up to New England and turned into this rum. And this is kind of a famous diagram. Often there's a fourth leg here going to Europe, going to England. The idea here is the Americans are trading all over the place. They're breaking this system. They're not cooperating. Why? Because England's got a lot of things going on. There's a whole bunch of wars with France. England has a civil war between Parliament and the King, and Charles I is executed, and you've got this Puritan dictatorship under Cromwell. So all this stuff is going on for a period of over 100 years where the colonies are basically being neglected. And you've got that phrase, you've learned the phrase salutary neglect. The colonies are being ignored because of all this business that's going on between England internally and with the French in a series of wars. But it's a salutary, it's a healthy or a benign neglect, which is allowing the colonists to become de facto, in practice, independent. They're worshiping freely, they're making their own laws and their own legislatures, and they're freely trading. So this is going to create a huge problem when the English clamp down after the French and Indian War. That's kind of the pivot between the division between this unit and the one coming up on events that will lead to the Revolution. Two last things here to take note of. From 1685 to 1688, you have James II. James II is a post-Puritan Commonwealth, Puritan dictatorship, King of England, who is sort of resurrecting this idea of divine right. And he's going to basically erase the self-government of a whole bunch of the New England colonies, and he's going to create what's called the Dominion of New England. From 1685 to 1688, you've got this sort of mega colony, a mega colony that consists of New England and New York, and it's being ruled by a governor sent by the king, and he's imposing the Church of England, and it's just bad news for the colonies. They sort of see their freedom slipping away. And this ends very abruptly in 1688, where Parliament rises up against the king, throws him out in the Glorious Revolution, if you remember your world European history, and they shop and they bring over a new king from the Netherlands, King William of Orange, with his wife Mary, who is English, and things are restored back. Self-government is essentially restored under, there still will be a royal governor, but there's this kind of a preview of, English tyranny, what it can look like, and the Americans at this point have become very jealous, very self-sufficient, very jealous of their freedoms, of their rights, and the expectation that they will be ruled without interference from England. So we'll be looking at the French and Indian War, because when that's over with and the French are finally removed from the Americas, Brits are going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts and mercantilism and sort of ending this salutary neglect business. So there goes your drive-by review of Unit 1. So good luck, gang. Signing out.